Bonsoir, everyone. Thank you for being here, and especially thank you, Emily, and thank you, the American Library team, to have me tonight and to have this conversation about the Bradleys, pioneering literary agents. And I'm very, very happy to be able to talk about and introduce.
Well, you've already identified a key word for this evening, which is agent, literary agent. And that is what is particular about the Bradleys, is that they were operating as literary agents in France. In fact, you claim they were the first literary agents in Paris. So I want us to start with an incredibly simple question for those who might not know. Can you tell us exactly what a literary agent does in the literary ecosystem?
Okay, yes. So what is interesting is that what we all have in mind in terms of what a literary agent does in the present is that this person, he or she, is representing an author. And that's wrong. That's exactly what the Bradleys were not doing, and as a matter of fact, were forbidden of doing by the French publishers. So basically the Bradleys, as literary agents, could do any task of intermediation between authors, publishers, translators, except for being a direct representative of an author. And that's specific to France, because the French tradition of publishers is that they considered, and probably still consider to a certain extent, that they are the best advisors for their authors. So essentially the Bradleys still had many, many things to do and still contributed very much, but they were left with the other tasks. That is to say, the articulation with foreign publishers when it came to publishing American books in France and French books in the United States. So the first main task was that of what is called still today a sub-agent. And the sub-agent represents a publisher with another publisher, usually in a foreign context. And then you have the job of co-agent, which was also okay for the Bradleys to do, according to the French publishers. And so the co-agents represent another literary agency also abroad. So they have like a partnership with a literary agency in London or in New York. And with this partnership, they're able to bring foreign books into France or to sell French books in these foreign markets. And another job that we are also familiar with and that still stands today is the scouting part. The notion that a literary agent, upon its own initiative, is going to bring a book into a publisher's catalog or publishing list. So the tasks are quite varied, not very well defined, and certainly not at the time, because as you suggested, Emily, in the early 1920s, when the Bradleys started their operations and their business, in the early 1920s, there was no such thing as a literary agent in the French landscape. Sure, literary agents existed in the English-speaking world as of the mid-19th, late 19th century, big agencies in London and in the United States, but not in France. And so Bradley kind of cut his way through this publishing world of France, where he was a foreigner, and kind of imposed himself as a key intermediary. And this went hand in hand with the more international turn that the French publishing industry took, introducing more and more foreign books.
And we're really seeing at this period, 1920s, 1930s, the birth of the modern publishing industry. We're seeing figures like Macmillan, like Knopf, who are developing these publishing houses. We're seeing the book transformed into a sort of commodity, the book object. It enters into the marketplace. And we're also seeing the transformation of the figure of the author as well. And I want us to get to all of this. It's an ambitious task, but I think we can. But I think first you need to walk us through who exactly Jenny and William Bradley were, how did they meet, and what was the birth of the Bradley Literary Agency.
Okay, I'm happy to do that, but I really agree with you that the context and the way I've kind of interpreted their personal, even intimate trajectory. They are, after all, a couple, so there is part of an intimate story there.
It's a love story.
But the background and the interpretation that I'm offering is indeed of a publishing industry becoming more professional, the books becoming more commodified through, marketing techniques, processes that became more and more rationalized, and also a book industry becoming more and more international. And that didn't really happen until the 1920s. And literary agents, because they were left with that one task to do, basically, played a big part in this. But back to your question.
First the Bradleys.
First the Bradleys. So before the Bradleys were two distinct people, persons, each on one side of the Atlantic. Jenny Serruis on the one side, who was a Belgian national, actually, but whose family quickly moved to Paris because she was one of the youngest, and the older siblings were having their career in Paris. So the whole family ended up moving to Paris. So she was a Parisian, very much so. Very educated. She was born, in the later part of the 19th century, but nevertheless, and this was obviously not the case for many women at the time, many young women. Very educated, allowed to travel extensively, even on her own. So very sort of liberal kind of education. An Anglophile, completely bilingual in English, studied in London and also worked, taught in London and Edinburgh. So, a very cosmopolitan figure on her own, even before she met William Bradley, who obviously brought her into a even more international life. So this is the background she came from, a very wealthy background, but also a very artistic, intellectual, politically connected kind of family. Her brother was part of those who negotiated the Treaty of Versailles, at the end of the First World War, and then became a leading figure in the government in the post-war era. So a very, very well-connected family, and quite educated and worldly woman. And on the other side of the Atlantic was William Bradley, an American, also coming from a quite wealthy and well-to-do family on the East Coast, educated at Columbia, and he became an editor and a publisher in the United States. So he had this experience on the side of the publishers. And the meeting, the encounter of the two took place, in the backdrop of the First World War, when William Bradley, then an officer of the US Army, came to France to accomplish a number of assignments. He was not involved in combat. He was assigned with tasks of what was called at the time social hygiene, which was, a way to surround the soldiers when they were not fighting, when they were being trained in camps, or when they were, off the fights and the front, supporting them with a number of activities, in particular artistic and intellectual activities, so they would not drift towards, social ills such as alcoholism or, prostitution, for example. These were, big concerns for the military, état-major. And so he came as an officer, but as I've explained, he was very much involved also with French charities and French associations and French artistic networks, so as to provide the soldiers with these educational programs. And this is how he met Jenny then Serruis, who was also, as a French young woman, involved in a number of charities supporting civilians, supporting the arts during the war. So she worked for the Croix-Rouge and was then involved in a number of artistic associations, and also in a very kind of narrow program, but that leads on to an interesting anecdote, an association that was called French Homes that allowed officers of the US Army to have dinner and a pleasant evening in a French family. And sure enough, you know where this is going. William Bradley once was invited in the Bradley family, where he spent a pleasant evening talking.
Teaching them French manners and feeding them frog legs. And
you never know. But probably talking literature and definitely meeting Jenny at that point.
And how do we get from here to the Bradley Agency? How does the Bradley Agency come into being?
So the next step is that William Bradley, even once he was freed from his military obligation, never returned to the United States. Well, he did eventually on business
Many
trips.
of us
but
here can probably relate to this.
Yes, decided to stay in Paris in relation to the relationship, with Jenny. Well, he needed to become employed because even though you come from a wealthy background, you still, need to be busy yourself and have an occupation. And so he, from one task to another, and one is going to involve the American Library in Paris, so maybe I can tell more about that. But, from one assignment of scouting for his literary and publishing friends in New York, from some translation assignments, which he also conducted, gradually he became, the intermediary between the American publishers, whom he knew personally very well from his early career in the United States, and the literary world that he came to know through the Bradleys, who were, as I said, very well connected and also had a very intense social life with a salon where he was able to meet a number of important, eminent representatives of both the political world and the publishing, the artistic world. And he sort of naturally became this intermediary who could speak English, which was not so obvious for a number of people in France at the time, and kind of imposed himself with one very efficient and convincing move that he introduced for French publishers, which was that at the time, the United States did not respect any international copyright laws. So until the Bradley Agency was set up in 1920, in the early 1920s, 1923, in the best case scenario, if a French book was published in the United States, well, in the worst case scenario, if a French book was published in the United States, or an English book, or a German book for that matter, in the worst case scenario, it was published and the author, the original publisher, would never see a cent of any of this. That's how it was done. In the best case scenario, and this is really what was happening mostly, gentleman's agreement, a discussion under the form of a sort of a flat fee. So, they would give $100 and that was it. What Bradley introduced was the same kind of process and negotiation as for an original publication, an advance, royalties, and therefore, if the book was hugely successful, this made money for the publisher and the author. And if the book was not really successful, that wasn't a big risk either. And so gradually, French publishers came to realize that this was a game changer, especially as more and more international literature circulated. It can be established that William Bradley made the publishers, the French publishers, more affluent than they had been. And one interesting sign of this, I think, is that Bradley officially started the literary agency, in the very early 1920s, and in 1926 he received the Légion d'honneur for the services rendered to France because of the circulation of French books he had allowed in the United States. So that that's quite a feat.
And the authors that he's working with, kind of on both sides of the ocean, are Hemingway, Stein, Joyce, Richard Wright, D.H. Lawrence, Henry Miller, Faulkner, Malraux, Gide, Valéry. Like, the list doesn't end. The extent to which he was truly at the center of all these different pathways and networks of cultural exchange. And you have such an interesting characterization of the literary agent and of Bradley's role as a literary agent In this book, you call him the double agent and the border man, and you write that crossing land and culture, embracing multiple roles and careers, trying to surmount the limits of an elitist literature which resists sale, or trying to implement commercial strategies with authors who resist them. And what's so interesting here, Laurence, is the idea of the ambivalence of the literary agent, that he straddles these multiple roles, and that he crosses these different borders between representing the interests of the publisher, representing the interests of the author, representing the interests of America, representing France. There's a certain slipperiness to it.
Yes, there's a matching in what you are describing in both the complexity and the ambivalence and the in-between in the profession, in the circle of publishing, in the book industry, but also as far as the Bradleys are concerned, and in the case of these literary agents, also the intermediary position between two nations and two cultures. So they're really straddling different worlds all the time. And that even works for, you know, if you look at smaller spaces, such as salons, for example, because you do have French salons in Paris, one of them being the Bradleys. And so every Friday night they would host a salon.
And on the Ile Saint-Louis.
On the Ile Saint-Louis. But this salon itself, although it was Ile Saint-Louis and it may sound very French, was really a French-American space, because the regular visitors were usually French, you know, André Gide, representatives from Gallimard who would be there regularly, but every week there may be a new visitor from the United States, and therefore contacts could be established there. And there were other salons, of course, that, you know, there was kind of a circuit that people would go through. Friday afternoon would be at Natalie Barney's on Rue Jacob, so an American heiress and you know, patron of the arts and of literature, and in her salon. But she was very much a patron of French literature, so her salon was really also genuinely French and American. And so that would be Friday, you know, afternoon, having tea at Natalie Barney's, and then Friday night having champagne at the Bradleys on the Ile Saint-Louis. And on Saturday, don't miss Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas' salon. And many of the people in attendance were really part of these same circles. And business was also being made, and literature, of course,
and
you
so
know, in
there's
these spaces.
This confluence of the social and the economic and the artistic, they're all happening in the same place at the same time. And that time and place is Paris in this time period. And I think that this is a story that we're all quite intimately familiar with, is the idea of 1920s literary Paris. It's an image that I feel I've adhered to quite closely. It matters to me a lot in my position here and my position at the library. And something interesting that you identify, or that you kind of posit in this book, is that there's a certain mythology of 1920s Franco-American literary relationships. So when we think of the Rue de Flores, La Rotonde, Hemingway, you know, sipping champagne and absinthe, how truthful is this myth that we've developed?
Well, it's true that we like this story and this narrative. I'm not going to destroy it, don't worry. I want to keep it.
I'd be out of a job if you did.
But what the Bradley archives, and you know, you've said before that the Bradleys were kind of at the center of so many writers, and you know, the point is not just to name dropping and show how important they were. I think what it shows is the complexity, the multiplicity of the worlds they straddled. So yes, there was this bohemian Paris, this modernist Paris with Hemingway, but also Henry Miller, Anais Nin. These were modernist figures, or review editors like Margaret Anderson or Jane Heap, who had moved from the United States to Paris, you know, to publish more freely. So we have also we have this bohemian Paris of Hemingway and Stein. the modernist, hard at work at trying to renew literature and style. And of course, Joyce is in the picture as well, with Sylvia Beach and Shakespeare and Co.
And he was a dear friend of Jenny Bradley as well. She was offered to translate Ulysses and turned it down, I believe.
Turned it down, probably busy with her new life, having just met William Bradley, but remained close to Joyce and ended up translating one of his plays. So this connection remained. But what I've wanted to show in the book is that there was also a Paris at work, including in the publishing world. Because when Sylvia Beach has Ulysses published, when William Bradley, through another American printer in Paris, has Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller published, or when also William Bradley has Gertrude Stein's The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas published by Random in the United States, so that that's all geographically very diverse. That involves a lot of people at work for also literature to become available to the readers. So as much as I also enjoy this myth of a bohemian Paris, which existed, I was more interested in the kind of professional and busy Paris,
the kind of invisible motor behind it. That's
and also concerned literature. Sylvia Beach, for example, really almost killed herself in the publication of Ulysses, which was a very, very hard process. So, very hardworking literary people, which is maybe not what the mythology has kind of conveyed.
And when we talk about the ability of the Bradleys, of the literary agent, to inhabit these different roles, to slip between worlds, we shouldn't forget that they were also creators, artists in their own right. Jenny Bradley was a translator. William Bradley wrote as well. So it's not this dichotomy we've established between the artist and the businessman doesn't hold with them.
And that leads us back to the interesting references that you reminded of border men and women, donc c'est hommes frontières. And I think I also try to show that many of those who animated the literary world endorsed several roles. So translators in particular sometimes became agents. We see this kind of a transition often, but I'm also thinking about those who wrote the prefaces, for Steinbeck, for Faulkner, and that could be, for example, André Malraux. So, he was a writer obviously in his own right, but also contributed to the circulation by introducing the books. And Faulkner was really no one at the time, not even critically acclaimed in the United States, and something that, the French publication of Faulkner, through the work of his translator, Maurice Edgar Coindreau, and then of those who wrote the introductions and prefaces, and that could be André Malraux, that could also be Paul Morand, so other French writers, but who also, worked for the transmission of foreign writers. So I was very interested in how this redefined. So it both allowed me to discover some figures like the Bradleys, like translators. Coindreau was fairly known, but I came to realize how important he had been as a translator and also a professor in the United States of French literature. So he really kind of operated in both countries under a different kind of profession. So, getting to know figures who had not been previously known to me and hoping to have, to shed light on them, but also rediscovering the role of luminaries and people we think we know very well, who actually, I came to realize, did more than what we thought we knew about them.
It's so interesting. I think the theme we keep coming back to tonight is this idea of circulation. So circulation between these different roles of artist, of business, and circulation between the publishers and the writers, and then circulation between America and France. And this is obviously with the development of modern capitalism as well, the circulation of the book object. So we see these multiple pathways of movement, circuits of exchange happening, and you identify amidst this trend of circulation a sort of tension that emerges, an anxiety, actually you identify three. I've written them down. There's this idea of reciprocity versus influence, circulation versus imperialism, and mediation versus invasion. And these all touch upon an anxiety that is expressed by the French about the arrival of American culture on French lands. Tell me about this anxiety at this time period.
So the trajectory of the literary agency of the Bradleys allows, because it starts in the early 1920s, is to look at how, actively American literature was being circulated in France in the interwar period. And here comes the reciprocity, because just as equally, French literature was really being pushed in the United States, quite successfully, given the Légion d'honneur, at least for the interwar period. So this is where I defend this idea of reciprocity that I really discovered. And, there are something like 245 boxes in the archives of the Bradley Agency. So, it's a huge archive. And it's really quite equally shared between French contacts and American contacts. So I really like this idea that they had a very balanced position and that the circulation was quite balanced for some time. But the reciprocity is like a premise, I think, especially in the interwar period. And to me, this is the way, the French taste was kind of educated to American literature in translation. At the same time, in Germany, the way American literature was being circulated was in English through publishers who published, the original version. So the German public was educated in a different way. The educated German public was allowed to read in English, which the French, that was not the way, the American literature was circulated. But nevertheless, the French, became used to reading in good translations, and publishers became used to paying, not hugely, but paying for good translations. And to me, what happened in the interwar period needs to be connected to what has often been identified as the surge of American literature after the Second World War. And I see it more as a continuum that was prepared by mediators such as the Bradleys, but also through the presence of so many Americans in cosmopolitan circles in Paris in the interwar period. So I see it more as a continuum that helps to explain the popularity, the success, the volume of American literature present in the 1950s and 60s, because the taste of the French readers had been, prepared for it, and because the publishers were ready. They were ready to deliver when something like a collection like the Série Noire, the mystery novels, crime novels from Gallimard, became hugely successful after the Second World War. This is really a result of this preparation, so to speak, because good translators were at hand and publishers knew how to push American literature, to the French. And this is the way I try to nuance and qualify this notion of invasion, which, we might be able to identify given the sheer volume of American literature, but I think it's more interesting to see it in a continuum.
And this is what you mean when you talk about le siècle américain, the American century.
Yes. So the American century is this expression that, a lot of us take for granted. It is this notion that the second half of the 20th century is the American century, the domination of American culture and a form of American power that is hard to deny, obviously. But I'm more interested in the complexities of the siècle américain and not just, the diplomacy, the arm wrestling in terms of politics and diplomacy, but also how culture contributed to a genuine attraction for American culture in France, which of course did not go without tensions and hostility sometimes, because some of the books the Bradleys contributed to publishing in the interwar period. I mentioned Paul Morand earlier on, but there are other instances of books that were published by French writers and then translated into English through the agency that were very critical of the United States and kind of also rooted a French tradition of anti-Americanism. So But to me, this is still a circulation of thoughts and of critical thoughts. So I'm very interested in that. And that stems from the French as well.
And where does the American Library fit into the siècle américain and the history of the Bradleys?
Thank you for this question.
I've been saving it for the end, the grand reveal.
So I'm really happy to be here tonight for many reasons, and this is a very interesting conversation. But it's true that both, I would say, as a French academic and French native, having studied English in Paris, the American Library in Paris has had a significant place in my education, in a space to work and to have access, because this was, a long time ago. And so it wasn't so easy to have access to literature in English. And so I've worked in this space a lot. And so it reminds us of the importance of institutions like this, French-American institutions, institutions who, that try to bridge cultures between France and the United States through culture and through books. And I recognize the dynamics, for the Bradley Agency as well. And it's, of course, it came as a very interesting moment in my research when I realized that among the different tasks that William Bradley was, conducting in a kind of chaotic way in the early 20s, trying to work for publishers, translating, that he also had a few months, an assignment here at the American Library in Paris at the very moment the library was being set up as an institution. There was a transition, and it very much follows also William Bradley's, individual path from an officer of the US Army who was preoccupied with providing the soldiers with an educational background, artistic activity. And some of that was accomplished through the library war office, so the war office and the library services. And at some point after the war, those services wondered what was going to happen with those millions of books that had been brought into Europe. And the hope was formulated that an American library in Paris could be set up as a continuation of that circulation of books, and also very much so, I think it's in the spirit in the emergence of this institution, very much as also a symbol of the French-American cooperation. And so in these moments of uncertainty, the key point was fundraising and finding a place. And that's when William Bradley was actually the secretary of the American Library in Paris. And so, participated in those funding moments. And I was very lucky to be very welcomed here when I was doing my research, and to have access to the archives of the American Library, and to find letters written by Bradley to a number of donators, and to see how he had contributed to this, which is very much fitting to the rest of his career, and to also, to me, the multiplicity of institutions that contribute to the French-American conversation through books and publishers and the private book industry, but also institutions like libraries, universities, and an array of different institutions.
And I didn't realize this, but if I've understood correctly, in the history of the American Library, we were able to become a permanent institution thanks to a very generous donation by a man whose last name was Seeger. Yes, and it was Bradley himself who kind of brokered that deal, right? He was the one who was in contact with Seeger.
And Seeger's, motive to be such a generous donator that allowed, the fundraising to be successful as had been hoped, was that his son had died. His son, so American citizens, both father and son, had died in the war, and his son had been living in France and had kind of adopted France as his country and had fought for France, before the United States became involved in the military combats. And so, we have an American soldier dying for France, for the freedom of France and for the values that he considered, he wanted to embrace, and his father allowing through a generous donation for an French-American institution to live on. So that's, I think, that really fits in the narrative.
And it continues to live on today. And in fact, actually, if we can show this to the audience, the Bradleys also donated a significant portion of their library to the American Library. And so we recently found in our special collection, or the special collection of the American University, who has loaned it to us tonight, a book that the Bradleys donated, which has both, maybe if you could hold it open and I can hold the microphone so that we can be careful with this very delicate edition. It has these lovely illustrations inside, but then if you can also see here, we have both the official stamp of the American Library in Paris, our original address, 10 Rue de l'Élysée, and then the writing, Mr. W.A. Bradley, as well. And if you flip the page, you'll see the stamp from the official Bradley Literary Agency as well. So this is an instance of cultural literary history that is still very much alive today, and is located in places like this, which is why it's so incredibly special to have historians like you who are able to bring these hidden histories to the surface and to make use of archives like ours, make these keep the life of these archives alive. So thank you. On that note, can we have a round of applause for Laurence, please? So I have many more questions prepared, but I'm not allowed to be selfish, so I have to turn it to the audience now. And we have Miss Jacqueline in the back who is ready to take it away. So.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm wondering how you as a French person got initially interested in the Americans in France in the 1920s.
Well, thank you for this question, and this is also how I arrived to the Bradleys. So the original work that I did for my doctoral research and for my PhD years ago, I think is a consequence of this French-American dynamic going on, because the work that I did was on how. The question that I raised in my dissertation was, how was it possible that African American writers in France had been so popular, so much published? The reception of African Americans, both in the interwar period and after the Second World War, was a puzzle to me. Because it's not that the French had any idea of what was going on in the United States and had like a previous interest. It was an encounter. And so the answer that I provided was that I looked at book publishing and the book industry, and I looked at who were the publishers, the translators, who had made it possible for great writers and artists of the Harlem Renaissance in the interwar period, or for luminaries like Richard Wright and James Baldwin to not just establish themselves in France. This was their personal trajectory, but how come they had also become successful from a literary point of view and well received? It wasn't to me an obvious consequence that when you live in France, you conquer the public automatically. And so I found that it was the work of publishers, translators, that had been instrumental in doing that. And kind of in passing, I saw that name, Jenny Bradley. She was the literary agent of Richard Wright, but really, I couldn't find any information about her. And in 2015, I was a visiting professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and all my colleagues kept telling me, you need to visit the Ransom Center, the Harry Ransom Center, this wonderful archival library. And so I went there because, I love libraries. And I was talking to the curators. What do you have on Richard Wright? I was thinking, well, I might get an article out of this, and then, that would be very interesting for me to write on an article, to work on an article. And they opened to me the Pandora box of the Bradley archives, and I realized that, like me before, all the scholars who had looked at the Bradley archives had looked at it through an author. I was getting at the Bradleys through Richard Wright. I was only interested in Richard Wright at the time I started looking at the archives, but gradually working on my article and looking at other parts of the archive, I realized that the Bradley Agency was an object in itself and not just because I'm interested in Faulkner or in Richard Wright or in Colette or in Gertrude Stein, you know, in the authors they served, but they were interesting in themselves. And that's how 2015, a few years ago, you know, the research project started.
Other questions in the audience? Don't be shy. We have 10 minutes. Now's your moment. If not, I have more questions. So I'll let your thoughts percolate as I ask one more. I want to turn to the present. So we've talked about this idea that perhaps there is a French perspective on the siècle américain, which sees it as a sort of invasion, the arrival of American thought on French soil and the taking over of French systems of thought. I see a parallel with what's happening today, and I think that you, as a professor of American studies at a French university, are situated at the very heart of this, which is this sort of reoccurrence of this anxiety that American ways of thinking are corrupting French systems of thought, French language, French culture. We see this in the sort of debate between wokisme and universalism. We see it with different departments at universities that feel as though the American education system has taken hold in France. What echoes do you see today of this anxiety that you've studied?
Thank you for this question. I didn't know you were going to talk about wokism. Not my favorite.
I couldn't resist.
So the way I see this anxiety, I think, is kind of constitutive of the French-American relationship and the French like expressing anxiety at what the Americans allegedly impose on us, the French. What I see in this is the French capacity of critical reaction that, you know, I see in the interwar period, I see after the Second World War, and actually I see also today. I also tend, and this is my maybe you know, scholarly approach, I tend to consider that some of these attacks and worries are based on a lack of full knowledge of the complexity of the American landscape and complexity of thought. Hence, you know, the need to go on in sharing and feeding this conversation to try and kind of circumvent those misunderstandings.
And do you see a resolution to this? Where is this tension, this friction between France and America on an intellectual landscape heading, in your opinion? You have 10 minutes. Go.
No, I think taking a step back and seeing this as a continuum is what I would say. You know this kind of a. Before I was saying that I was a little uncomfortable with some of the kind of like periodizations. You know, you have Bohemian Paris in the interwar, and then you have something else, the Saint-Germain climax in the post-Second World War. And you know, if we go a little bit, you know, as French historians have taught us, in the longue durée, I think that's when it's really interesting to see how, you know, there are fluctuations. And it's true that if we focus on today and the anxiety and wokeism, it's worrying and it's not very pleasant. But as scholars, we have this luxury of, you know, taking a step back and looking at things, you know, from a distance. So it's not very political what I'm saying, and not bringing a solution, but, you know, really having I think another kind of perspective, which we like to have in academia, and that brings perhaps less anxiety.
And I think that this is what's so special about your work, is that you introduce these perspectives that were hidden to us previously that we might not have recognized. I think a lot of us, when we consider literary study and the study of literary history, we don't consider the role of the literary agent, which is a story that you've uncovered. So what is the importance of locating these different perspectives, these different hidden agents in literary production to the study of literary history?
So I think I was going to say something else about the anxiety, which is the curiosity that I very much see in students, and that is reassuring. I think French students are very curious about the United States, not judgmental, curious. They want to ask questions, they want to know more. And when I taught, at UT Austin, I had this one class on American travelers in France, and I found that the students on this American campus were also very curious and asking questions and using me as a foreign professor to know more about France. And I think this curiosity is really very healthy instead of judging without having the full picture. And so this curiosity also applies to fields of study that we maybe take for granted. The literary field, we think we know how it functions, and there are really great book historians. For example, in France, we had Roger Chartier, who was really a pioneer of book history. In the United States, Robert Darnton. So there was a conversation there too, very interesting in this particular field of scholarship, of book history, a French-American conversation or a French-English-speaking conversation. And what I found using their work is that they didn't make any space to literary agents. It just wasn't in their vision, which is okay. They provided us with some perspectives, some tools to study book history, and now we keep adding to it by being curious and asking questions about new mediators. So I've become particularly interested in literary agents, obviously, and what I have found, for example, if I that's what I have in mind right now, is to kind of continue chronologically, because I stopped my study in 1960, but Jenny Bradley was still a literary agent until the 1980s, and it seems now also that I'm talking about my book in different occasions, that the literary agents that kind of took over in the 1960s and 70s, some of the leading figures were two women, Mary Kling and Michel Lapôtre, and they were two French-American women. And I find it so interesting, and I want to look more into that and see how they too, with Jenny Bradley, who was still working at the time, kind of collectively this time, because in the 30s, the Bradleys were more or less isolated. There was another agent that I should not ignore, who was Michel Hoffman. But I'm interested in this kind of configuration that I seem to see of people who are still like the Bradleys across America and France, women in particular. I'm very interested in that, and I want to look more into it. So remaining curious, and figures we don't know about enough.
Do we have time for one last question? If anyone has thought of one. Oh yes. Okay. Wait. Put your hands back up again. Come back. Yes. Here first.
With the volume of literature that's being produced today in America, do you see a trend in what's being preferred to be translated here?
I wouldn't know exactly, but one thing that comes to mind to my mind, listening to your question, I was really interested when I saw, and now I'm going to forget, a new publishing house in France becoming specialized in nature writing. Someone going to help me? And so a new publishing house setting up in France, identifying a trend of American literature that would be of particular interest to the French. And this trend, and I'm really sorry, I forget the name of the publishing house now, but specifically nature writing. And in the process, making some American novelists successful in translation, once again, when they had not been in their original publishing in the United States.
Another question back here.
Yeah, it's more a comment than a question, if I'm allowed to. I want to thank you for bringing up the memory of Alan Ziegler, because it's an extraordinary Franco-American story. I mean, he was a student at Harvard and enlisted in the French Foreign Legion, and is a famous poet of the First World War. And actually, his famous poem, "I Have a Rendezvous with Death," was supposedly, very much liked by John Kennedy. So, yeah.
Was there a final question?
Thank you for this comment and reminding of the poem that he was also a poet.
Hello, thank you. I'd like to hear more, if it's possible, about the tensions that were risen. I only jotted down reciprocity against influence. I don't really remember the others, but I'd like to know who were raising those concerns, if there were some people in particular who were concerned about this kind of influence, or if it was more generalized.
Yes, thank you. It's a really good question. I think it's especially after the Second World War when there was a greater volume of American literature being translated into French, but when there was also a political backdrop of mounting tensions in the context of the Cold War, and that reviews in France, literary reviews, political reviews, kind of use the object of American literature as, an object of disagreement, and especially, to kind of simplify the story, you'd have leading communist newspapers or literary reviews identifying American literature as, a way of a certain ideology to pervade France. And so I've studied that a little bit, and it was my understanding that American literature had become a French object, in a way, a French object of a French dispute amongst French, to kind of express their own disagreements. And that's also, I think, what is very interesting with cultural exchanges is how when an object crosses the Atlantic, and we see this with wokeism, or indeed, it no longer belongs to the country it left, but now to the host country that is going to transform it through a debate that's very specifically rooted kind of nationally. So we see those dynamics. Yeah.
And then final question over here.
Hi. So I was just curious if there was any research that really surprised you that didn't make it into the book. If you can give us a sneak peek.
You mean research
So, like,
I thought about? And
so you mentioned you were really curious about after the 60s.
Yeah.
So maybe in the next project, is there a surprising piece of research or a fact that you found in the archives that you'd like to share?
Any fun anecdotes or raunchy love letters?
No, I have an anecdote that it doesn't really answer your question, I'm afraid, but I have an anecdote for, like a researcher perspective, which was that once I had identified that the Harry Ransom Center had this wealth of archive, and I decided I really wanted to explore it, I applied for a fellowship and was happily granted it by the Harry Ransom Center, but that was only going to happen like a year from now. So in the meantime, I had the opportunity to go to New York for a brief research trip, and since there was also there was some archival material in Columbia because of William Bradley's status as an alumnus, I decided to do the brief research there, and this is really how I kind of entered into the Bradley's trajectory. And what I was looking at was all the drafts and interviews for the project of a biography of Jenny Bradley. So I was a little afraid because I was thinking, if the biography was never published, but what am I going to do with this material? If it's excellent and the biography is almost written, I can't plagiarize it, obviously. So maybe I'm going to New York to decide that I need to give up on this project. And so I looked at this, and this was a biography prepared by Ellen Worden Erskine, and she had been the wife of John Erskine, an American writer, and they'd been close to the Bradleys. And so when Ellen asked Jenny in the 1970s to write her biography, they were friends, and she agreed. And the material that I found was not written at all, complete mess and chaos in the boxes. So point one, I was able to conduct my research. But what I was reading was really awful in terms of how Jenny Bradley appeared. She was being very kind of rude in the interviews, very closed, not really, playing with her friend who was writing her biography. And I was a little uneasy and I didn't know what to make of it. But I persisted and I thought, well, maybe I'm going to write about someone who's not friendly, but still important.
That's okay.
And
Men are unkind all the time. Why can't Jenny be?
I'll have a distance with my object. I won't love her. But actually, when I started to work on the Austin archive, I found the other side, which was that, Ellen Erskine was really not being serious about the project, and Jenny Bradley was so uncomfortable because she was a friend, she didn't want to push her friend away, so she was kind of playing along, but really, not really. And so she was writing other friends how, how could we make this project fail, nicely, so Helen Erskine is not, upset, and so I was reassured also on the fact that Jenny Bradley was actually a very kind person and an interesting person. So these were the ups and downs of the beginning of the project.
Can we have a big round of applause?